Colombian President Gustavo Petro, who's actually the first leftist president elected in Colombia, comes from a guerrilla movement, the M19 movement, has largely positioned himself on the left of the spectrum here in Latin America, decided to turn back 2 military planes that were carrying Colombian deportees into Colombia on the basis that they were, one, being transported on military planes, which was sort of out of protocol. Usually civilian planes are done. That's part of Trump's theater. It's actually cheaper to use civilian planes, but he wants to send this message. And they were shackled, right, in their ankles and by their hands. Many reported abusive treatment in the facilities before their deportation. And so he said, listen, we will accept them. They are Colombian nationals. It's not about that, but you have to treat them better. And of course, Trump's response was to fly off the handle, to immediately impose or threaten to impose 25% tariffs that would rise in a week to 50%, going after members of his government specifically, imposing visa restrictions and saying that Colombian products would be subject to more revisions, all this kind of stuff. And, eventually through diplomatic negotiations, that didn't come to pass. I think what Gustavo Petro did was really good. He wasn't talking about, I'm not going to, accept the deportation flights. The coverage in mainstream media has been awful, trying to say that, Donald Trump made him bend over and accept these conditions, right? All he was saying is treat them with dignity. You don't have to, put them in chains.
Desde el principio nos trataron muy mal, nos botaron la ropa, nada más nos dejaron guardar el celular, no nos dejaban bañar, la comida nos despertaban a las 3 de la mañana, nos esperaban que nos durmiéramos y a la hora nos despertaban, nos gritaban, a algunos les pegaron. La atención médica prácticamente tocaba lastimarse para que nos dejaran salir. El trato fue muy malo desde el principio, la verdad.
¿Y cambió cuando llegó el gobierno de Colombia?
Sí, ya el último día no nos dejaron bañar, nos dejaron cepillar, prácticamente nos trataron bien, ahí sí nos decían que gracias, que dónde vivimos y todo eso. Ahí sí se preocuparon del todo, la verdad.
¿Qué mensaje le das al país?
No, pues la verdad que estamos felices de volver. Ansiábamos mucho estar en nuestra tierra, extrañábamos la verdad estar por acá y que la verdad algunos nos arrepentimos de habernos ido.
But the point I wanted to stress is that this is kind of, this is what's needed in the region. We need to have presidents like Gustavo Petro who say, you can't go this far with this. You have your agenda, but you can't treat people this way. And in contrast, we have people like Nayib Bukele, which I understand is actually in negotiations with the Trump administration to do what I said about that danger.
The president of El Salvador, for those who don't know.
President of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, right? Far right actor, very, very close to that kind of ideology that Trump espouses. And, he's suspended constitutional guarantees in his country for many, many months now, more than a year. Was illegally re-elected to office, violating the Constitution there. But all that to say is that so he built these mega prisons and has engaged in a mass detention campaign. And I think it's part of his efforts to cozy up to Trump is to be like, yeah, send him to El Salvador. And the one thing I always say is that, mass deportation may ultimately translate into mass detention, be it in the United States in concentration camps, and I do use that term deliberately, that's what they would be, or in these mega jails that Bukele is building. That's a terrifying prospect, right? And in the case of Central America, they have special laws. In fact, anybody from Central America generally ends up being accepted into it. And so they could be condemned. People from Guatemala, people from Honduras, could be in El Salvadorian jails as a result of these policies. And so it kind of gives you that contrasting picture of different responses from leaders in the region. Obviously, we know that where we stand here, which is that at the very least, protecting their human rights and human dignity.
I do want to go to the letter that Petro sent that was funny. I mean, it was like charismatic. He's a very charismatic leader. And he was like, I don't actually really like the United States. It's kind of dull, but I would have a whiskey with you and we could talk about this, even though I don't really drink whiskey that much. And but one thing he was like, but I don't really know if we could talk because you think that I am not worth the same as you because I am Colombian, and he's like, and we are not going to step down to you. So I think, in the end, even though his resistance, I think it did lead to negotiations. I think I do differ a little from Jose Luis, unlike that the headlines. I do think they are definitely criticizing him, but I think it is true that Trump did somewhat win, that they were able to send their military deportation planes here, even though Petro said that is not what would happen. But I do think it's amazing that this is the discourse that is being discussed, where he says Colombia no longer looks northward, it looks to the world, right? Trump's inaugural speech is about how the US is no longer in decline, and this challenge that China is now the country that many look to, and that is what is happening in Latin America, where Colombia is saying, no, we don't look to the US anymore. I think one thing that's amazing here in Mexico, culturally, of course, there's still a lot of connection to the United States culturally, and there will always be. But I think of all of my friends in the past few years, and all of them where they want, not all of them, a large percentage of friends where they dream to go is Korea and Japan. No one wants to visit the United States anymore. They don't care. They don't want to be in this whole long visa process where they think they won't be treated well, but they think it's boring. And I think it's interesting to see, when they talk about the soft influence of Korea culturally, it's really, you could see it in Mexico. And I think that relates to what Petro is saying here. Like, fine, if you don't want us, we don't care. But in the end, there's a reality that the US was like, okay, then fine. We're not going to give visas to anyone in Colombia anymore. And people are like, oh, you're not going to give us, of course there is a panic there that then, because you're prohibiting their freedom of movement, that people can no longer go to the United States. But anyways, yeah, so it's up there. I definitely recommend people check out his letter. If you speak Spanish, definitely read it in Spanish. It's much better. But,
in fact, let me just read a little bit of it, and then I'm going to let you respond, Jose Luis, because I know you have a little bit of a disagreement there. But there's a lot of great stuff. He mentions, I confess that I like Trump. He writes, Trump, I don't particularly enjoy traveling to the U.S. I find it a bit dull. Still, I must admit there are admirable aspects. And then he says, I confess that I like Walt Whitman, Paul Simon, Noam Chomsky, Arthur Miller. I also confess that Sacco and Vanzetti, whose struggle and sacrifice reflect my own roots, hold a special place in U.S. history. Is he Italian, I guess, Petro, or what? I don't know why it reflects.
I think it's a reference that he has Italian heritage.
Okay, that must be, yeah. Right. And deep cut with Sacco and Vanzetti. Maybe we'll get into that later with Greg Grandin. But yeah, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were Italian immigrant anarchists executed in 1927 after trial tainted by bias against their political beliefs and immigrant status. They became global symbols of labor rights and resistance to injustice. And then he writes, I don't like your oil policies, Trump. Your greed will destroy the human species, perhaps one day over a glass of whiskey, which I'll accept despite my gastritis. We could talk frankly about this, but it's difficult because you see me as part of an inferior race, and I am not, nor is any Colombian. He also gives a shout out to Allende, the CIA-backed coup, overthrow of Allende, the support for Pinochet. He mentions that he survived torture. He says, I survived torture and I will survive you. I do not want slavers near Colombia. We've had many and we freed ourselves. So what is your take on why this was not the failure that the media is portraying it as, Jose Luis?
Because I think the dispute was always about, treating them well, to not allow Trump to engage in this silly white supremacist theater, because that's what it is. And I think Petro is right to call him out on that and saying, you see me as lesser. I think that's a lot of what's driving these policies, and about, placating his xenophobic racist base that was expecting Trump to do this kinds of action to, there's an official messaging that deportations have begun coming from the White House, offices and social media accounts. But I do think that, there is limits to this. And I think this whole episode shows that, yeah, he's willing to back up his bark with some bite, right? But also, he's not invincible. You can stand up to the bully. I think by trying to placate him constantly, you're going to find yourself in the position of like Justin Trudeau, who ultimately lost his position as prime minister as a result of his mishandling of this file. I think the response by the head of CELAC. So CELAC is a community of Latin American and Caribbean states. It's sort of the progressive alternative to the OAS, the Organization of American States. It includes all the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, save for the US and Canada. And she, as the head of the CELAC group, called for an emergency meeting, which is meant to take place this Thursday. And I think that's exactly the response. There has to be a united response, because if we allow this to play out on a state to state basis, he's going to divide and conquer. And so Latin America needs to present a more united front. And I'm very glad that there was an enthusiasm for this meeting, to present that meeting. And also, Gustavo Petro announced that he will be taking over the leadership of CELAC, which is, I think, also a good sign to show that continuity. There was a deliberate effort by the United States to try to destroy these institutions, because they do understand that they do provide that counter-hegemonic place for the region to unite against U.S. imperialism and U.S. intervention, which is also part of what this agenda is about, right? Why was he threatening to take over Panama again? It's such a weird contradiction, because it's a bit isolationist when it comes to economic policy, but also he seems to have a legitimate interest in territorial expansion.